November was extremely eventful in Ukraine. The Russian army is increasing its pressure simultaneously on several fronts, putting the embattled Ukrainian army in a very difficult situation. A major corruption scandal is shaking Ukrainian society, putting its trust in the authorities to the test, at a time when the very statehood of Ukraine is under attack. Simultaneously, the Trump administration is pressuring Kyiv to accept a controversial peace deal. Today, we will attempt to unpack all of these developments from the war in Ukraine. Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible. We usually start our monthly update videos with a description of the main developments on the battlefield. But it feels like we're at a critical juncture in this war, and it would be helpful to take a bird's-eye view of the war's overall results so far and its most crucial recent trends. At the beginning of the war, Russia had several publicly stated goals, like denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, protection of the Russian-speaking people, along with many other self-evident strategic goals and those regularly claimed by Russian officials. Let's take a look at some of them. In the absence of explicit criteria for denazification and demilitarization, let's assume the obvious. Demilitarization is turning the enemy's military into a non-factor. Has Putin achieved that? Ukraine had a much smaller army, equipped with almost exclusively Soviet-made weapons and equipment at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Its artillery, armored vehicles, tanks, air defense systems, air force, basically everything but anti-tank weapons like javelins and Endlaws, Stinger manpads, TB2 Bayraktar drones, some Humvees and patrol boats were Soviet-made weapons. Fast forward to late 2025. Ukraine is now equipped with Western-made tanks, artillery, multiple rocket launchers, armored vehicles, fighter jets, long-range missiles, air defense systems, and so on. Ukraine has also massively expanded its domestic military production, manufacturing artillery systems, electronic warfare systems, long-range missiles, and most importantly, they are one of the leading drone producers in the world. Beyond any reasonable doubt, the Ukrainian army is much better equipped right now, while significantly depleting Russia's military storage of the pre-invasion period. What about the personnel? In January 2025, Zelensky stated that Ukraine had a standing army of 880,000. That is a massive increase from the some 250,000 men and women the Ukrainian army had in early 2022. Of course, the army has suffered major losses while defending the country from the invasion. We do not know the real casualty numbers for the Ukrainian army. A volunteer project, UA Losses, collects official information, media reports, social media posts, and other open-source information regarding Ukrainian losses, and estimates that as of November 2025, almost 170,000 have died or gone missing. The vast majority reported as missing are, unfortunately, most probably dead. Of course, not all deaths and MIA cases find their way to open sources, so Ukraine's military losses are higher than this estimate. Along with that, using the usual method of tripling the number of deaths, we get around 500,000 more wounded soldiers. Many of them get only lightly wounded and return to the army eventually, but others get permanent injuries not compatible with military service. So we may assume a very rough estimate of 300,000 to 400,000 permanent losses for the Ukrainian army. That is a huge number. Undoubtedly, many of the fallen were experienced and well-trained officers and soldiers, and every death is hard felt by the Ukrainian people. Nevertheless, speaking purely from a military standpoint, war is the most straightforward way to gain military experience. As a result of the Russian invasion, many more Ukrainian officers and soldiers have this invaluable military experience and capacity. In that sense, the Ukrainian army as a whole is way more battle-hardened and experienced than it was in 2022. So, one of the publicly stated goals of the Russian invasion, demilitarization of Ukraine, is not going well at all. On the contrary, Ukraine now has a much more powerful military. What about denazification? In Putin's propaganda, the Ukrainian government is Nazi or backed by Nazis. Hence, the most straightforward way of understanding denazification in this context is the removal of the current Ukrainian government. Russia has also failed to achieve this goal. Zelensky and his government are still standing. The most powerful opposition parties are in solidarity with the current government, agreeing that the Russian invasion must be opposed. Those mentioned as potential rivals of Zelensky in future presidential elections are people like the former commander of the Ukrainian army, Zaluzhny, and the current chief of military intelligence, Budanov, who can hardly be suspected of harboring any sympathy towards Russia. There is zero chance that any pro-Russian party or politician will win elections in Ukraine for generations to come. Putin made sure of that by invading Ukraine. So the only way of achieving a Putin-style denazification is to topple the Ukrainian government and install a puppet. The prospects of these are extremely unlikely. Even though initially Russia did not proclaim territorial control as its strategic goal, arguing that Putin never had a goal of capturing as much Ukrainian territory as possible and as many cities as possible, including Kyiv, would be pretty stupid. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has captured one major regional center, Kherson, only to lose it a few months later. The capital, Kyiv, and big cities like Kharkiv and Odessa, which Putin sees as part of the Russian world, are firmly under Ukrainian control. After the initial failure of the Russian invasion, the Kremlin publicly proclaimed control of Donbass, along with Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, as their goal. Russia has captured a large portion of Donbass since then, but the most fortified agglomeration in the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk area is still under Ukrainian control. Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts are far from being fully captured by the Russian army. Ukraine still has access to the Black Sea to ship its goods. The biggest strategic territorial achievement of Russia so far has been the capture of a land bridge connecting Crimea to the rest of the Russian-controlled territory. So Russia has mixed results in terms of their territorial conquest goals, with some successes and some failures. Other proclaimed strategic goals, like forcing neutrality upon Ukraine, reconstruction of the European security architecture, promotion of rights of the Russian speakers in Ukraine, and so on, have not been achieved either. Still, admittedly, things may change depending on how the war ends, particularly if isolationist forces become stronger in the United States. So to conclude this very brief look at how Russia has done so far in this war in terms of achievement of its strategic goals, the picture is not very pretty for Putin, all while losing around 1 to 1.5 million people and thousands of pieces of equipment. But does that mean Ukraine is winning the war? General Zaluzhny admitted that his initial calculation was that by inflicting massive losses on Russia, Ukraine would force Putin to stop. But this has not been the case. We have not observed any pressure from Russian society to force Putin to stop, and there's nothing to suggest that this will suddenly change. This has allowed Russia, which has far greater resources and manpower, to wage a war of attrition. A war of attrition in which the Russian army is not making huge gains, but maintains strategic momentum and dictates the events on the battlefield. This has been the case since the failed summer 2023 counteroffensive. The only time since then that Ukraine has tried to regain initiative on the battlefield was the Battle of Kursk. Although the Ukrainian army was initially successful, ultimately the Kursk operation did not alter the battlefield dynamics in favor of Ukraine. The Russian army forces Ukrainians to defend and is gradually taking over Donbass. Again, this has not been easy, and the toughest and most fortified area of Donbass is still under Ukrainian control. Still, Russia has been able to choose where to attack, and more often than not, they have captured its target area in a slow grind. Bakhmut, then Avdiivka, then Chasiv Yar, and now Pokrovsk. To be fair, Ukraine has managed to stop Russian attacks in Kharkiv and Sumy oblasts, but this has not changed the overall situation in favor of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. At this point, Russia is attempting to complete the capture of the Pokrovsk-Minohrad area, along with Huliopole, Kupiansk, Seversk, and Liman. Ukrainian defenders are fighting valiantly, but waves of Russian infantry attacks, infiltrations, and fiber-optic drones make their job extremely difficult. At this point, Russia will eventually capture these towns too. After many failed attempts, after thousands of losses, in battles which may last more than a year. Manpower shortages remain the key problem for the Ukrainian army. According to Zelensky, Ukraine mobilizes about 30,000 people into the army each month. While this is on par with the Russian monthly recruitment rates, the problem persists. One of the main causes, and a symptom of other major problems, is the rising rate of desertions. A journalist, Ihor Litsenko, claimed that in October 2025 alone, there were 21,602 AWOL cases in the Ukrainian army, with a whopping 161,461 criminal cases launched because of unauthorized leave of military bases or places of deployment in 2025. To be fair, many of these soldiers then return to their bases or report to other units of the Ukrainian army, but still, such a high number of AWOL cases clearly demonstrates command problems. Many are also tired of the war to the point of not wanting to fight. This further complicates the manpower and morale challenges. Internal problems such as political infighting and corruption scandals only exacerbate the demoralization of the Ukrainian people. In November, Ukraine's anti-corruption agency launched an investigation into the state nuclear energy company Energoatom, which implicates 2 ministers of the current government and a personal friend of President Zelensky. Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, and former Minister of Defense, Rustam Umerov, 2 major and powerful political figures, are also being investigated in connection with this case. Yermak has already resigned, and just the fact that Ukraine is trying to fight corruption even in such dangerous times for the state is positive. But the alleged involvement of people close to Zelensky in a corruption investigation has a major demoralizing effect on society and the army, along with decreasing trust in the government and the president at a very sensitive moment. Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities have a demoralizing effect too. Such attacks occur several times a week now, killing civilians and destroying Ukraine's energy and railway infrastructure. Just this month, on November 14th, 7 Ukrainians were killed in Kyiv. On November 19th, at least 34 people died when Russia destroyed a residential building in Ternopil. Ukraine's air defense is working around the clock and shoots down most drones and missiles launched by Russia. But there is not a single country in the world which would be able to neutralize every single air threat facing such regular attacks. According to Ukrainian officials, Russia has a capacity to produce 2,700 Shahed drones monthly, which means these air attacks will continue. Ukraine is also hurting Russia with its long-range strikes. Its oil infrastructure remains the main target, with the main aim of causing problems for the Russian economy, as the Russian oil giant Rosneft announced a 70% year-to-year drop in profit. And this surely does cause problems on top of other economic problems that Russia has been experiencing lately. But again, the damage caused by Ukrainian strikes and Russia's economic woes are far from the level which would cause a proper collapse and force Putin to stop. The fact that the United States, under the Trump administration, is now acting more like a mediator than an ally supplying the Ukrainian army remains a major problem for Ukraine. The Americans are still selling weapons, but the whole process is volatile and depends too much on the existing political climate. Whenever the United States may need to pressure the Ukrainian government, it can use weapon sales as leverage, just as they apparently did when a new peace deal was offered to Ukraine, which we're going to talk about in a bit. And although Europe has picked up the slack in terms of weapons supply to some extent, Ukraine continues to operate American weapons systems. It can only use these systems if the Americans continue giving them ammunition for them. For instance, Patriot air defense systems and HIMARS multiple rocket launchers, both crucial for the Ukrainian defense. In November, 8 European countries pledged to provide $500 million to purchase weapons from the United States. And later, NATO Secretary General Rutte stated that Ukraine will receive $5 billion in military aid from the United States by the end of 2025. Ukraine also signed an agreement with France, envisaging the purchase of 100 Rafale F-4 fighter jets and 8 SAMP-T air defense systems. But in the best-case scenario, Ukraine will get this equipment by 2035. Ukraine also received a military aid package worth €300 million from Spain, which includes Iris-T air defense missiles. In other news also related to air defense, the Ukrainian state defense company, Ukroboronprom, signed an agreement with a Czech aviation company stipulating the production of interceptor drones. In recent months, most of the weapons and equipment supplied to Ukraine have been defensive in nature, such as air defense systems. It corresponds to the Ukrainian army's current needs, and also reflects Ukraine's current plans and priorities, to defend, not to attack. Only the Ukrainian political leadership and military command truly know the extent of resources available to the army, the problems they are facing, and whether these problems can be realistically solved with the available resources. Putin believes that at some point the pressure on the Ukrainian army will be too much for it to bear, which will cause a collapse of its defenses. This has not happened yet, and it is up to the Ukrainian leadership to decide whether they can hold the front as they have been since the summer of 2023, and for how much longer, or for as long as needed. for as long as Russia keeps coming, until the scale of Russian losses becomes unbearable, or until international pressure may force Putin to stop. Whatever the Ukrainian government's calculation is, it figures into the assessment of every peace deal offered to them by the Trump administration. So let's conclude the video by talking about the new 28-point peace deal developed by Putin's negotiator Kirill Dmitriev and a real estate developer turned diplomat Steve Witkoff. The deal envisages Ukraine withdrawing from the unoccupied Donbass, which would become a demilitarized zone under Russian control. The rest of the front line would be frozen along the current front line. Following the end of the war, sanctions against Russia would gradually be lifted. Ukraine would give up its aspirations to join NATO and agree to cap its army at 600,000. No NATO troops would be deployed in Ukraine, and NATO would agree to halt its expansion, but Ukraine would receive unspecified security guarantees. $100 billion of frozen Russian assets will be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine, with the United States receiving 50% of the profits from this effort. Europe is expected to add an additional $100 billion to Ukraine's construction. The electricity produced by the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would be equally divided between Russia and Ukraine. Many other provisions of this deal would take too much time to analyze, but several points require further attention. First of all, Russia continues demanding the surrender of Donbass as a prerequisite to stop the war. The only plausible scenario in which Kyiv may agree to this is if it receives concrete, legally binding security guarantees to ensure Russia will not attack it again in a few years. This deal mentions security guarantees in vague terms, but demands that no foreign troops be stationed in Ukraine. This remains the biggest obstacle to Ukraine giving up Donbass without a fight, and is seen as an act of capitulation in Ukraine. Many other provisions of the deal, such as those related to the future of NATO and reconstruction of Ukraine, require the consent of Europe. Still, it is clear that the United States and Russia are trying to sideline them from negotiations. This immediately makes these provisions unworkable. On the other hand, there are several curious points, which may indicate that Russia is backing off from some other extreme demands it had made in previous deal attempts, particularly regarding the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. For instance, the 2022 Istanbul negotiations, which mostly remain as the benchmark for Russian demands from Ukraine, envisaged a maximum limit of only 85,000 soldiers in the Ukrainian army, along with strict restrictions on the range of its weapons. This deal has a way more generous limit and no range restriction. This may be an indicator that Russia may back off from some of its secondary demands, or it's just Putin's understanding of a compromise. In any case, this deal is being seen as a capitulation in Ukraine, rather than a fair starting point for genuine negotiations. It was pushed on Ukraine at a time when it was being hard-pressed on the battlefield and experiencing internal problems due to the aforementioned corruption scandal. The Trump administration thought that the corruption scandal, along with the threats to stop selling weapons, would be sufficient to pressure embattled Zelensky to agree to this unfavorable deal. Evidently, Zelensky was under a lot of pressure, and this could be noticed in a somber speech he made a few days after the proposal was made, in which he pointed out that Ukraine now had to make a choice between losing its main partner and agreeing to a life without freedom and honor. But soon after that, Ukrainian diplomats and officials started renegotiating this deal with their American counterparts. And although we do not know the full details, Ukraine has been able to remove some of the most unfavorable provisions from the deal. Kyiv continues to insist on a ceasefire and a freeze of the war at the current front lines to start real talks. It continues refusing to surrender any territory not captured by the Russian army without real security guarantees. Kyiv's red lines are clear. But Putin insists on the surrender of the rest of Donbass, along with no clear security guarantees for Ukraine. And if Ukraine does not agree to this, so be it. Putin believes that his country can keep enduring major losses, and that Russia's economic problems can be contained. He intends to keep pushing until Ukraine agrees to succumb to his demands, or until he achieves a collapse of the Ukrainian front. But he has been trying that for almost 4 years now without achieving his goals. Finally, let's look at visually documented equipment losses suffered by both parties as of December 1st, according to the data compiled by Oryx blog. Russia has lost at least 4,250 tanks, 10,516 vehicles, 311 command posts and communication stations, 2,241 artillery systems and vehicles, 170 aircraft, and 166 helicopters. Ukraine has lost at least 1,338 tanks, 5,589 vehicles, 75 command posts and communication stations, 1,101 artillery systems and vehicles, 111 aircraft, and 52 helicopters. Further updates on the Russian invasion of Ukraine are on the way. If you don't want to miss them, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.